Our last speaker today is Nicholas Watts. He's a senior Buchanan Fellow. He'll be graduating this spring with a degree in anthropology and minors in archaeology and history. Nicholas plans to spend a year after he graduates participating in ethnographic field work abroad in Romania and within the United States in further pursuit of his thesis topic on the cultural impact of football. Please welcome Nicholas.
All right, everybody. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the sport of football. And honestly, there's quite a lot of ways you can watch football. You can be the casual fan or hardcore fan following your specific team. You can follow specific individuals over the length of their career, collegiate and professional. Maybe you're that red zone fan who only likes to watch the highlights or see how well your fantasy players are doing. But what happens when we look at the sport of football from a cultural perspective? And that's what I've done here, analyzing positional labeling in the NFL through anthropological methods. So first thing we're going to have to address here is what is culture. This is the anthropological laundry list definition of what culture is as defined by E.B. Tyler in 1865. Culture or civilization, taken in its wide ethnographic sense, is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So basically that's just a very long and drawn out definition that describes ways in which man has created societal rules and customs in which to survive in his environment, his or her environment, and interact with other people. So how does this relate to the sport of football? Well, actually, there's quite a lot of ways you can view football culturally, and in fact, we do it all the time. It's in the media, it's in our households, it's all around us. So in analyzing something through the lens of cultural anthropology, you consider cultural implications of everyday phrases, actions, processes, etc., basically anything that could potentially end up on that laundry list I read a moment ago. You identify patterns and variations, and then you analyze them for context and meaning relative to that culture. And then you share that analysis with others. And these two images here give some pretty good examples of different types of cultural phenomena that have been observed in football as recently as this year. You have the civil rights national anthem protests with the kneeling players, which has been the focus of just about every pregame from now till about a year ago. And the image here on your left would refer to the concept of people discussing how violent is football. Is the game less violent than it was 20, 30 years ago? Do further actions need to be taken to make it less violent? And these are all examples of part of a cultural phenomenon of sports that permeates our everyday lives. So I decided to focus my thesis on positions and labeling. I wanted to know what constitutes a player playing a specific position, and is it completely built upon their past collegiate or pro experience? How much of that actually goes into it? Because there's almost an unspoken, subconscious criteria for each position. And I would hazard that just about everybody who watches or participates in the sport of football has been guilty of this at one time or another. You have a preconceived notion of what a position is supposed to look like on the field. And these positions can be further divided within a position. The most infamous one is probably the quarterback position, which can be generally divided into those who are pocket passers and those who are dual threat quarterbacks. And pretty self-explanatory. It's either primarily a passing quarterback or a rushing quarterback. And how do concepts of identity, masculinity, and ethnicity fit into this process, and can they be racially driven? Interestingly enough, the answer to just about all of these is yes, to a varying degree. So to understand this, you first have to understand this process that just about everyone who participates in the sport of football is guilty of, and that's called the look test. The observer relying on tradition, precedence, and his own personal perspective on the player to form a definition for the player's position, style, and quality. And probably the best examples of this within the NFL are the scouting combines and NFL draft, where a player is quite literally broken down to his most basic form almost like meat on a slab and compared amongst his peers for certain qualities and attributes that would make him a beneficial member of a football team. Let's see. A good example of this would be positional prototypes. And a positional prototype is, again, relying on that look test and kind of that examples of previous players that have found success in the NFL, and you want to kind of emulate that is the goal of a position prototype. A great example of this is defensive end and outside linebacker Julius Peppers. He's 6'7" and weighs 295 pounds and ran, I think it was a 4.54, 4.44 at the NFL Combine. That's probably a little too fast, actually. But the benefit of this is he has the size that is valued by defensive coordinators to play on the defensive line, but he also is fast enough to play in space and even cover agile offensive players as well. And he's found a great deal of success in the NFL. I think going into his 15th year now back with the Carolina Panthers, he's one of the NFL sack leaders, well over 100 sacks, and this year he's kind of had a resurgence. I think he's at 8.5 now, which is well above the average for someone of his age, almost 40 years old. And you notice the trend of drafting positional prototypes in the form of him. In the last 2 or 3 years, you've had first-round draft picks. Jadeveon Clowney was very much compared to him, both in size and in play style. And just last year's first-round pick by the Cleveland Browns, Myles Garrett, drew a lot of comparison to Julius Peppers. And what this illustrates here is how the look test perpetuates the concept of players as commodities. Very expendable, not really as human beings. I think a meme circulated in 2014 of Jadeveon Clowney standing on the stage as the first-round draft pick with his number 1 jersey, and a comparing image, or contrasting image, I should say, was right next to it depicting the 1860s, 1850s slave trade. So you can kind of see the comparison there of a player being utilized as a commodity. So this goes into my thesis topic. What was my original topic for my thesis was the concept of Polynesian players being labeled as instinctual defenders. And over the last 3 years, I have had the fortune to freelance sports write for the NFL. And it was in one of these games that I witnessed the fellow here in the top left-hand corner. His name is John Timu. He's a Samoan-descended middle linebacker, plays for the Chicago Bears. Last year, in a game against the Detroit Lions, both teams are winless. And in the beginning of the third quarter, the Lions are at 3rd and goal, down on the goal line, and the Lions were sure enough just 1 yard away from a touchdown. They were going to score the football and possibly win the game. Now, just as soon as the ball snapped, John Timu, who had just been removed from the practice squad 4 days earlier, slips through the left guard and center and tackles the running back for a negative yardage. Now, this game, according to both myself and my peers, was the catalyst for the game, but it was how we described the play that differed. I saw an intelligent play. I saw a player that was reading the snap count, had recognized a play he was told to recognize in practice by the defensive coordinator, and had just made a very smart, intelligent play on the ball. My peers, however, viewed the play more as instinctual. And this was very curious to me, especially since the testimony from both himself and his peers following the game was that he is one of the most intelligent football players you'll ever meet. This comes from both veteran players, defensive coordinators, and his own testimony. He said, I was just prepared. I recognized the play. However, this testimony didn't help in removing that instinctual label from him. And in further research into the subject, just about all Polynesian descended athletes who play in the NFL play from a defensive position or an offensive line position. And they are quite often detailed as being either instinctual, violent, warrior-like. You'll notice some pretty famous names up there. Troy Polamalu down on the bottom left, Junior South, middle linebacker for the Chargers in the 90s, Hall of Fame player. In the top right, Haloti Ngata, who's currently playing for the Detroit Lions, but has had I'd say an all-pro worthy career with the Baltimore Ravens as well. So what is the basis for this label being imposed on these players? And I answered the question myself as soon as I was reviewing my peer's work. It was the fact that he was Polynesian. It was based almost solely on his ethnicity. It's an ethnically driven label thrust upon players of Polynesian descent. And it's an enduring reaction to colonialism. So when the Polynesian islands were first, particularly New Zealand, Hawaii, and American Samoa, when they were first colonized, one of the first things the colonists did was remove the ability for tribes to go to war with one another. They also took away a lot of their sporting activities as well. Bird hunting in New Zealand, whip top spinning in New Zealand, and even surfing was banned for a while in Hawaii. And in a cultural context, this was very damaging and detrimental to the islanders, because these cultural phenomena, these sports, allow them to attain status, attain power. It's very much a driving factor in their culture, and without that, there's obviously a void. And to fill this void, they replaced them with Western sports. Baseball, rugby in particular, but most recently, American football has become the most prominent sport. It's often erroneously attributed to genetic variation and superiority. I'll just go ahead and say it's a complete myth. There is no scientific evidence that one of these socially constructed concepts of race is better designed for any task than another. However, you will also find that a lot of the Polynesian athletes that play in the NFL will perpetuate that myth. And that kind of goes into the next aspect of this label, is that it's a product of poor economic situations in the Polynesian islands. After the Navy left, the American Navy left a lot of the Polynesian islands in the 1950s, and it became a part of the Department of the Interior, a lot of jobs were lost, and it's been, especially up until recently, an area of abject poverty. In the 60s, they attempted to add some work programs and also had a government-implemented plan to introduce tuna canneries to the island, but one of those has since shut down, and neither of them could have properly supported the entire population of the island. So you have a sport like professional football, where the rewards for succeeding at it are incredibly high. It's a way to attain agency in which you can attain an education, you can attain financial well-being, and the most important part about this is how it connects to the cultural concepts in Polynesia, particularly in Samoa. It's this concept of Fa'a Samoa, the Samoan way, and the concept of Malaga, where you are expected to return after more or less what they call making good, which is succeeding in your career, your lifestyle, whatever it is you choose to be your profession in. You will return to the island, and that you will redistribute that wealth to the next generation so that they have a better opportunity than you did before. And this is something you can see in pretty much all of the Polynesian athletes in the NFL. On the bottom left there, you have Troy Polamalu, who makes regular visits to the island of American Samoa, sponsors football camps, provides missionary work, all of that type of thing in that concept. And there we go, propagated by those athletes as a way to garner economic and social capital. And it's not just economic either, it's social. Especially in the 70s and 60s, when the financial portion of being a professional athlete was not quite as high as it is now. These players would return to the islands with the social capital, the experiences abroad, the education, and they'd be able to impart that on the next generation. So then we have this interesting variation here with current Titans quarterback Marcus Mariota. He kind of bucks the tradition, so to speak. In all of NFL history, there have only been 3 Polynesian-descended quarterbacks. The first was Joe Francis in the 1950s, who was famously beat out by Bart Starr of the Green Bay Packers for the starting position there, and Bart Starr went on to have a Hall of Fame career, and Joe Francis faded into obscurity. You also have Jack Thompson, the throw-in Samoan, from the 1970s and early 80s, who set the NCAA career passing yardage record in college, but failed to make any impact in the NFL. And probably most recently, aside from Mariota here, was Marcus Tiasapopo in the early 2000s, who spent his entire career as a backup quarterback for the Raiders and Jets. So as you can see, over 100 years of football history, only 3 quarterbacks. And in only his 3 years in the NFL, Marcus Mariota has completely outpaced either of those 3 careers or those players. So what this illustrates here is that these labels are incredibly durable and that they can last over a long period of time and often take something as, well, significant as a talent like Mariota to overcome them. But this leads into another concept. I didn't want to just study one label because not all labels are necessarily ethnically driven. So I also wanted to continue to use Marcus Mariota as a case study for this and break down his position of play as well, pocket passer or dual threat quarterback. Now this has a number of issues in it because aside from the pocket passer, which you can more or less be statistically broke down into a more quantifiable definition, there's no real quantifiable definition for a dual threat quarterback. The closest thing to it is the expectation that a dual threat quarterback can rush for over 300 yards a season. Well, that didn't quite fit with my perception of that or anybody else's really. It wasn't very consistent because if you were to base it off that, there'd only be 3 in the league right now. And there's far more than that. So what I ended up doing was coming up with a statistical model, I guess you could almost call it an equation, for which to break down what was a dual threat quarterback, or at least provide an accurate estimation of one. So I took all of the 2016 starting quarterbacks for the NFL and I broke down the average rushing attempts over the length of the longest NFL career belonged to Tom Brady, so going back all the way to 2000. So I took average rushing attempts, and to stay away from any statistical error involving backup quarterbacks or quarterbacks that throw one pass, or in Nathan Peterman's case this year, 5 interceptions in a quarter, decided to only take quarterback rushing yardage from those quarterbacks who rushed for more than the average attempt. So you could see here over the length of this would be the career average for a player. So say Cam Newton's been playing since 2011. That line represents the average rushing yardage over the average attempt for quarterbacks during that time span. So the logic being, if his career average exceeds that line there, representing his comparison to his peers, then he could, with a reasonable certainty, be considered a dual threat quarterback. And it's rather telling in the analysis here. It comes out to roughly a 60% pocket passer, 40% dual threat quarterback league when looking at the starters. You'll also notice down there at the end the 3 rookie quarterbacks from last season, Dak Prescott, Jared Goff, and Carson Wentz. I did need averages, so I needed more than one season worth of statistics, so they were unfortunately absent this time around. Although, curiously, Dak Prescott would likely be considered a dual threat quarterback after this season if he continues on his current track. So this opens up another interesting cultural concept, is a race-driven label. And it's very curious that 60% of the 25% diverse quarterbacks in the NFL, at least from a starting standpoint, are dual threat quarterbacks. The only 3 that are an exception to this is Tampa Bay Buccaneers' Jameis Winston, who, especially after this year, will not be considered a dual threat quarterback by this analysis. Dak Prescott, who, as I addressed earlier, likely would after this year. And curiously enough, there's some trivia out there for any of you who do sports trivia. Sam Bradford, who is 1/16th Cherokee and identifies as a member of the Cherokee Nation. So interestingly enough, that this statistical model would seem to indicate that race is a driving factor in determining what a dual threat quarterback is. And that would also be supported by the look test and various testimonies that race contributes to the definition of a dual threat quarterback. Now, how does Marcus Mariota fit into all of this? Because as you can see from the model here, he is well and beyond falling within the range of a dual threat quarterback. But I wanted to further break down his performance down to individual games over the last 3 years and see if there was any evidence of him excelling as a pocket passer. And curiously enough, he has on a number of occasions, including his very first game when he was about as perfect as a passer can be, threw for a passer rating of 158.3, the absolute highest you can attain, only rushed for 6 yards in the contest, and furthermore, however, he rarely gets recognition for his pocket passing ability. Whether in the media, radio, or on radio shows, anything like that, he tends to not get as much credit for his arm as he does his legs. And curiously enough, the day this thesis was originally finished, in October, it was that night there was a Monday Night Football game between the Titans and Colts. I'm sure if any of you are Titans fans, you were aware of this game. Marcus Mariota was suffering from a debilitating hamstring injury, but played the game anyway. And during the game, he played exceptionally well under poor circumstances, and threw every single one of his passes from the pockets, and ultimately was the catalyst in them winning the game. And I was both dejected by this and excited because it more or less proved portions of my thesis. However, it would require me to completely rewrite it the week before it was due. So I waited it out and waited for media confirmation of what I predicted would occur. And everyone was just lauding the fact that he had finally learned to pass from the pocket. However, in my thesis, I outlined how this was not entirely the case, and he even recognized in a couple interviews that I have passed from the pocket before, guys. I did it a lot in college. I also did it a lot my first year in the NFL. So what this more or less suggests is that these labels are highly subjective. In all, my thesis outlined how these positional labels imposed on players are highly durable. They're also complex, incorporating aspects of identity, ethnicity, and masculinity, and that they're highly subjective in nature, often without a proper definition.